Now, look, it's a rare thing for us to start a conference with the head of a communications agency. But we're here because this is a business that is still very much in its early days, and Ricardo Baca is one of its pioneers. Present at the creation with the incredible perspective that came from being the first cannabis editor at the Denver Post. As someone who's covered industry verticals for more than a decade, I feel confident that there's no one better equipped to tell the true story of the emergence of the cannabis business than Ricardo, who's moved to the communications field from the journalism side of the desk, is one that showed he's also got a keen instinct for business of his own. Damn it, I'm so jealous. So what I've asked him to do is give us his vision to set the stage for us. Think of his talk as the opening sequence of our movie, and the cannabis business is our character. Where does it exist in the world? What do people, consumers, authorities, politicians, investors, the media think of it? What are the public challenges it faces? Who are its allies? Where does it fit in our culture? In many ways, what we're going to hear from Ricardo is the current status of the cannabis business as a brand, which is an idea that we should all strive to understand as we move forward. So please welcome the founder of Grasslands, Ricardo Baca. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for coming out early for this keynote. It's wonderful to be here. I'm fascinated by your industries, let me tell you, as I've learned more about them, diving deep on this communication side. But Jeff, that was a great introduction. Nothing else to add, so especially since we have limited time here and so much to cover, I'm going to dive right in. And if you would, just honestly think about this as a 101. Some of this information will be new to many of you, and some of this information will be old hat. Regardless, I want to give you a foundation of knowledge from which you can build on throughout the rest of the day, and of course for months, years, and decades to come, because this industry is not going anywhere, and that's thrilling. All right, so we're going to start with some basic vocabulary and history lessons, starting with cannabis. Cannabis is both marijuana and hemp. Hemp is not marijuana and vice versa, but both fall under the category of cannabis, and that's important to know. Now, we associate certain chemical ingredients with each of these plants. We usually think of THC associated with marijuana and CBD associated with hemp. And the truth be told, both of these plants have both of those ingredients. But THC is, of course, this psychoactive ingredient that gets you high, that gets you stoned, that familiar feeling. It also has medical properties. CBD doesn't get you stoned, but it has those medical properties, in many cases, actually different ones. And THC, CBD, these are chemicals known as cannabinoids. And there are actually more than 100 cannabinoids. Those just happen to be the two that we know the most about, which is kind of alarming because, truth be told, we know very little about THC or CBD, let alone when you start going down the pike of CBN and THCA. So there's many other cannabinoids, but these are not the only chemicals that give this plant its medical efficacy or its special powers, because it really also relies on terpenes. Now, terpenes are flavonoids that are found in every plant, every tree, and they give plants their scent, their flavor. And of course, when you think about cannabis, it's an aromatic. And it turns out these terpenes, like limonene, linalool, they give it its scent and its flavor, sure, but they also add to its medical efficacy, especially when these terpenes are combined with cannabinoids. You might have heard the designations indica, sativa. Indica is a downer. Indica, couch. Sativa is more of an upper. This has been the terminology that we've used, especially through the illicit era and the early regulated market, to kind of differentiate these two sensations of feeling up and feeling down. Bud tender now will tell you you take a indica to sleep, you take a sativa to be creative. Truth be told, we are in the process of moving beyond those as designations, because it's actually more about that combination of cannabinoids and terpenes that brings you up than it is about this being an indica or sativa varietal. Also, quickly, the entourage effect. Now, Jeff just mentioned isolates. THC isolate, that's just THC. Lots of buzz around that, but there are no other cannabinoids or terpenes in that isolate. And what's known as the entourage effect is when you're getting that full spectrum of cannabinoids, terpenes, and there is early research telling us that that's where the legitimate, true medical efficacy of this plant is. And going along with that entourage effect, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the endocannabinoid system for at least a minute, because everybody in this room, all of our pets at home, have ECSs, or endocannabinoid system. Endocannabinoids are the key and the lock to phytocannabinoids, and of course, cannabis and hemp have phytocannabinoids, and they are the lock that fits into the key of our body. And our endocannabinoid system, our dogs, a cat's endocannabinoid systems, are the only reason that cannabis affects us the way it has, and has for millennia. All right, so a little bit about, I guess before I do that, a brief history of legal weed, because this is important. 2012, we saw Colorado, where I'm from, and Washington legalize adult use marijuana, surprising the world, and especially surprising everybody in California who thought that they were going to do it first. This is the single biggest drug policy shift of our lifetimes. Hands down, nothing compares. Because when you think about it, it caught on like wildfire. Oftentimes, people attribute that passage in those two states to the re-election of Barack Obama, driving a young voter base out who said, yes, we should absolutely legalize recreational cannabis. 2014 rolls around, we have the midterms, we have Alaska, Oregon, DC saying yes to recreational cannabis. 2016 was a big year. For this state and many others, it was not only Hillary versus Trump, but it was also 9 state ballot initiatives throughout the entire country voting on marijuana. 8 of the 9 ended up passing. The only one that failed was Arizona, which was trying to go from medical to recreational. 2018, we saw Michigan, we saw Missouri. This year, we saw Illinois, the government making the decision, not the people, not the ballot initiative process. And looking ahead to 2020 will be a very big election year at the state level for more initiatives. You know Arizona is going to try and go recreational again, and there's a good chance Florida is going to try and go recreational as well. And you think about how meaningful that is from a population standpoint, not only the number of people, but who they are and what a vulnerable population that is and how much they can benefit from this plant medicine. So how we consume this plant, it always baffles me when I'm reading the news and journalists are referring to smoking marijuana, automatically assuming that that's how we do it still. When truth is, of course, that is the number one category being sold is cannabis flower. But of course, we're seeing concentrates on the rise, edibles on the rise, and beverages in general industry terms. Beverages are considered part of the edibles market. Also, the topicals market with the lotions, salves, balms, beauty, healthcare, that is hugely on the rise, and it's making transformative change for a lot of people who want to dip their toe into the waters of cannabis. They feel comfortable putting that THC lotion on their problematic elbow. And then maybe they buy a vape pen, then maybe they try an edible or something. But this is generally how we consume. And of course, each of those methodologies have their own different ways of affecting us. So topicals are not going to get you high. So that lotion isn't going to get you stoned. And that said, 5 minutes after you hit the joint or the bowl or the vape pen, you will know exactly how elevated you are, how stoned you are, whereas that edible could take anywhere from 30 to 120 minutes to take effect. I also thought it would be helpful to jump through the basic industry infrastructure, just because unless you're in it, you don't really understand it until you hear it. But there are 3 primary licenses for this industry in every legal market that exists now. And if we're going along the cannabis life cycle, those are cultivation, that's a big one, people growing the plant. This is an agricultural product. This is a commodity crop. Number 2, manufacturing. So when you're making that topical, when you're making that beverage, that edible, or the concentrate, and keep in mind, as you'll hear later from my friend Sai, concentrates are, I believe, still the fastest growing category in this industry. To get that concentrate or that edible, you have to manufacture it, and that's a separate license. Number 3, of course, is retail. And other licenses exist, everything from labs that do the testing for potency, for residual solvents, for pesticides, for microbials and molds, or delivery services. That's another increasingly popular license in certain states. But it just helps to understand that that's where we're coming at this conversation from. And of course, because of the federal illegality, we see that cannabis grown in California is never supposed to leave California. If it's grown here, it will absolutely have to be sold within the state's boundaries. And even if you buy a product at a dispensary, like I did last night, you're not supposed to leave the state with that product because of federal illegality governing everything from at post security at the airport to them not knowing where you're flying to next. And moving on to this fun, the current political climate. And this is a fun one, especially to be having this conversation right now. The current political climate for cannabis is better than it's ever been. But at the same time, it's not ideal, and that's not saying much. The Pew poll just released a couple weeks ago told us that 67% of Americans support legalization. This has continued to go up for decades. We saw a big spike in the 90s, and then we saw it tank, and then in 2014 was the first time we ever saw a majority of Americans saying, yes, we want this legal. This legislative session in DC, we saw some monumental wins for this plant, for access, for sensible drug policy reform. And that includes 2 successful votes in the House, one for banking and one for national decriminalization. Now, do those initiatives stand a chance in the Senate? That's an entirely different conversation. But the fact that those votes happened on cannabis-specific bills alone is historic and monumental. And the fact that they passed this House is really encouraging, too. This just shows that there is movement. This is the first time a bill like that has ever passed in the House, and that's important to know. The Farm Bill, we're getting ready to celebrate 1 year of the 2018 Farm Bill, which legalized hemp, which effectively legalized all of hemp's derivatives. And that is huge because, of course, we're talking about CBD. But as Jeff said, even though CBD is legal, it is not quite legal for human consumption. And so that's why when you see a lot of these big box retailers jumping into the fold, signing these blockbuster agreements, oftentimes with very large Canadian entities, because they have federal legality north of the border, you see them dipping their toes in the water. usually starting with topical products, lotions, salves that you put on the external, your epidermis, and not something that you're actually ingesting or consuming in a more traditional manner, because of course those regulations are still being written and there is a lot up in the air, but that still is a huge signal for future growth. The fact that the federal government legalized hemp, and now the cannabis industry is wondering when they'll be next. This is now increasingly considered a nonpartisan issue. We're seeing more division when we look at demographics from older Americans compared to younger than we are Republicans and Democrats. And so that's a fascinating turn, and that just flipped in 2016, I believe. And then it's also worth saying that the state versus federal pains are real. Every single issue in this industry can directly find its way back to that very real conundrum, because this is still a Schedule I substance, which is a joke. It never belonged on that list. You know, we can talk about the various recreational substances we're here to discuss this week, you know, and we know that alcohol kills nearly 80,000 Americans a year. And the CDC tells us cannabis has never killed anybody. So this conversation is changing. It's changing rapidly, and you can see the very real potential for a lot of you in this room for this industry. And part of that potential is something that you know so well, and the cannabis industry is just starting to learn, and that is, of course, branding. You think about this early era. What we see right now with these brands is them trying to differentiate themselves from the rest of the market. You know, you think about who they are. I just gave a TEDx talk up in Marin County a couple months ago, and I opened it up by talking about how every cannabis brand in California is targeting one customer, the same exact customer, and that is the Marin mom. Truth be told, every cannabis brand throughout the entire world is targeting the same customer, and that's the Canna Curious. Because right now, less than 20% of Americans actually consume cannabis regularly, and that's a very small slice of the market. And so this market is looking at not me, who consumes 5-6 times a week. They're looking at you, who might not consume at all, or maybe you who haven't consumed since college. That is who they're looking at, because they recognize the tremendous potential of that, and they are trying to differentiate their brand from other brands, trying to make it appear more like traditional CPG, and that's really exciting. It's been a lot of fun to see. So, moving on to cannabis as a cultural commodity. You know, wanted to talk a little bit about on-premise, off-premise here. You know, one of the things that we're starting to see is THC only starting to emulate traditional retail. In 2018, it was kind of cute if you think about it, but that was really the first time we saw holiday packaging or holiday bundles in this industry. If you understand the packaging conundrums of this industry, which are many, so many that I don't have time to get into them, but they explored it for the first time, and sure enough, I was in a dispensary in West Hollywood last night, and Kiva has their peppermint chocolate bar back on shelves with the special packaging, and it's a product just like Trader Joe's with the peppermint JoJo's that you can only get during the holiday season. So they're finally starting to learn this and explore these opportunities. 2019, we're seeing the rise of slotting fees in this industry, which is also fun and kind of cute. Of course, slotting fees are decades old, but this industry is still somewhat new to them. And they've been around a little bit longer than this in the regulated marketplace. But truth be told, the biggest trade magazine in cannabis is called MJ Biz Daily, and they've written a couple large stories on that this year because of the rise of this. So now you don't only have to get your product in the store, you have to pay for your product for that shelf space, and that's pretty substantial. And that's the THC market. When we're thinking about the CBD market, we're seeing is pop-ups at Barney's inclusion at hotel minibars, Carl's Jr. and whatever the hell that was. And now we actually have infused pillows and infused mattresses, which makes 0 sense, but apparently people are buying them because CBD is the latest craze, and that's where we're going. One of the other things that's worthwhile to know is we're seeing this brand positioning outside of the market. So if you're a THC brand that can only sell in these few states, maybe you're releasing a related CBD brand that you can sell via mail order and e-commerce in all 50 states. I work with a client called The Clear. They're a top concentrates company. The Clear, you can buy their products in dispensaries in 6, 7 states. Wonderful concentrates. The Clear CBD is available to all 50 states. Same with one of our other clients. I work with Willie Nelson and all of his brands. Willie's Reserve, available in 6 or 7 states. Willie's Remedy is available in all 50 states. And one fun trend that my former colleague Alicia Wallace just wrote about at CNN, she just wrote that cannabis beers are now making non-alcoholic versions. So there's no alcohol, no cannabis, and they're selling them in liquor stores. And that is for brand recognition, because if you can sell NA beer in 50 markets, then suddenly your actual cannabis non-alcoholic beer sold in dispensaries has better brand positioning. And of course, all of this leads up to cannabis as the next CPG play. The potential here is obvious, and of course, it's the reason why we're here at the Cannabis Forum today. This is moving forward so fast, as so many of you know. If your business is not already here, then many of your competitors likely are. And I guess before I dig too deep into this slide makes sense because it is the next big CPG play, but I'm going to pull some vocabulary from our earlier lesson and correct it because it shouldn't say cannabis, it should say cannabinoids. Of course, cannabis is the home to all of these 100+ cannabinoids. And we're seeing THC blossom and develop in the markets where it's legal and regulated. We're seeing CBD explode in a way that's uncontrollable and unpredictable. But as I said earlier, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are more than 100 other ingredients, and that's what they are. They are ingredients that are about to emerge. One of our clients calls them emerging cannabinoids. And we know that each of these cannabinoids has particular properties that help us feel better, that make us feel a certain way. And, you look at what L'Oreal did, one of the largest cosmetics, health, and wellness brands in the world. They named CBD 2019's most trending skincare ingredient. So they're paying attention. Coca-Cola is, supposedly considering a big CBD play. I'm sure some of you in this room know more about that than I do. And we know that almost every major North American beer company is now somehow involved in this industry. Oftentimes, again, in cannabis or in Canada up north, because of that federal legality giving them better safeguards and more freedoms. So this is about cannabinoids, and forward-looking CPG professionals absolutely understand that this is where things are going. This is that new turmeric, that new ingredient that you already see being added to everything from coffee to pillows, apparently. And this is the direction that we're going. And it's really exciting to see, too, especially in this market, specifically food. Edibles are my primary method of ingestion. I don't know about you. I appreciate the long high. When you smoke, when you vaporize, it lasts for a shorter time. I like the ride of an edible. I appreciate that. And of course, drinks and beverages, that's a very complex market that a lot of people are trying to figure out. But again, it is an edible, so it's transitioning into your body differently than the smoke or the vapor, and it's unique, its own unique high. And before I invite Jeff back up here for a quick Q&A, I want to talk about a little bit about what's working, what's not in all of these fields that I've kind of touched on. And it makes sense to look at this through the lens of the single largest news event of the year in this industry. And it's dominated the news cycle of cannabis and hemp for the last 3, 4, 5 months, and that is what's been labeled the vaping crisis. People are dying. People are getting sick because of some of the chemicals that certain manufacturers and illicit market producers are including in their products. And these are the vape pens that are preloaded cartridges. So you put the cartridge on a battery and you inhale and you exhale the vapor. Cannabis is very viscous. It's very thick when that oil is extracted from the plant matter. You think about resin, of course, resin, it's sticky on your fingers for a reason. So what you have to do to make that cannabis vaporizable or atomizable is you have to insert an additive or a mixing agent to that. And we've been doing this for years, learning entirely from the e-cigarette market with Chinese technology. But there have been some problems. There have been some bad actors, most notably on the illicit market. But now the Boston Globe just published a report late last night that there might be some very serious conditions existing in the Massachusetts market right now from legal shops, which is massively concerning. Some of these mixing agents you might be familiar with because they're very common in food and beverage, things like polyethylene glycol or MCT oil. And the truth is, it's all about the matter of ingestion. How are we taking in these substances? Because MCT oil is like coconut oil. We know what we can and can't do with that. My wife gargles with it every night. That said, do we know the impact of inhaling MCT oil directly into our lungs and bloodstream? Because we don't. And that's where this has come. And so because of that, some of the things that are working, we're seeing brands step up, take responsibility, be responsible partners, publish lab test results. That is working because we are seeing ultimately a comeuppance that has been coming for a long time in this industry. We are seeing them stepping up and taking responsibility and becoming more accountable partners to the public. And I'll close with this. What this industry has proven is that regulation works. This is a very, very heavily regulated industry. And as exciting as it is, it's also incredibly difficult to be involved in cannabis at this very time. But we are seeing through this vaping crisis that a lot of the bad actors are just not going to be able to make this work. And they're bringing everybody else down, even though they represent less than 0.01% of the market. So with that said, we're going to hop into a Q&A, and I look forward to seeing what kind of questions Jeff has for me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, man.
So, yeah, the vaping crisis, I want to not downplay it because it's killing people.
Right.
What are the developments that need to happen, knowing the kind of concerns about uncertainty on the edible and ingestible side? What are the key things that need to happen for that to clear out some of the bad associations that are coming from vaping? Because that's become the fast lane for brands. I mean, there's probably better brand development on the vape side than anywhere else to date. So,
yeah, I mean, it helps to have a little bit of context there. As I mentioned, Illinois legalized earlier this year. They did that via the government, whereas every other recreational initiative came from ballot initiative, and that's the people coming out and saying, we want legal cannabis, forcing it upon their governments that we're not prepared for this. And so that's where we come up with MCT oil or polyethylene glycol, because the government wasn't ready to regulate this in the same way as they weren't ready to regulate regulate e-cigarettes, and then we were thrust into the unknown. But really what needs to happen is research, and especially the kind of large format social science research that we did back in the 60s and 70s, especially for alcohol and nicotine. And that is a sample size group of tens of thousands of people. What does regular ingestion of cannabis mean for that sample? What does semi-regular mean? What does the ingestion of high-potency extracts mean for your lungs? And that's the kind of research we need. And we are so devastatingly behind on research in everywhere in this field that is a very long way away, because, as I said earlier, there's infinitely more that we don't understand about this plant than what we do. And so we're just on the precipice of learning about individual cannabinoids, and we don't really understand the greater societal impact of what this could potentially mean.
So that sounds like an invitation for big pharma to get involved. Can entrepreneurs, do you think, fill that gap themselves, or do they not have the capability to afford these sort of large-scale scientific studies?
We see that happening, but really we know to fund these double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials that are needed, it's millions of dollars. We know that one of the reasons we're here discussing this today is because a big pharmaceutical company, GW, financed a giant clinical trial with their plant-derived cannabis pharmaceutical known as Epidiolex, and it became, in the last 2 years, the first ever plant-derived cannabis pharmaceutical to be approved by the FDA. So pharmaceutical can make that happen. Corporate is doing its best work at making it happen, but I think the most important thing that's happening in this conversation, in absence of a lot of this knowledge, really is us being guinea pigs, us figuring out that our neighbor with a child with epilepsy, that child is responding well to that, and then we have this growing body of anecdotal evidence, and it gives a company like GW the wherewithal and the encouragement and the confidence to do that clinical research, and sure enough, it comes out with the results published in the New England Journal of Medicine saying, yes, this is efficacious for this, and now we need to do it for everything else, including spasticity and PTSD and chronic pain, and that research is just now starting to happen.
So you're talking about sort of crowdsourced research and crowdsourced knowledge, and then institutional research and institutional knowledge. And I think that leads to this question, which is, you have this long history of crowdsourced knowledge, informal knowledge in the cannabis trade. Gray market, black market, dorm room. And and then there's this new set of entrepreneurs and publicly traded companies, and are they starting to work together, or are factions forming? I just wonder, is it as disparate as, the crowd at Lollapalooza?
Yeah, and then that's a great question, because it's a good conversation to have in California of all places, because this is the heritage market of heritage markets when it comes to this plant, this substance. And so you have this heritage market that's been around for decades, and many of them are suffering right now in face of a regulated marketplace where they can't keep up in many circumstances because of the immense barrier to entry and the many, many expenses that come along with being a licensed business in 2019. And so as the hippies and the freaks and the OGs are being pushed out of the industry, we are seeing a lot more suits coming in. But
you're the comms guy. Who's going to speak for the hippies and the freaks and the OGs?
Well, many of them can speak for themselves and do quite capably. But to get to your question specifically, I think where we're seeing this convergence, this coming together, is on the investment side, because you do have some OG brands. If you're familiar with Harborside here in California, started by activist Steve D'Angelo, who's a buddy of mine and a tremendous individual, and we have so much to thank him for. Yeah, now Steve and his team is taking Harborside public, and the people who are investing in him and giving him the financial wherewithal to carry out his dream, what started in DC as a yippie, and now he has shops in Northern California and soon beyond. He can only do this because of that collaboration with the suits, with the money, with the more modern people who are coming into this industry because they are now comfortable to say, I'm in cannabis, I'm invested in cannabis, whereas people like Steve have been doing this for 30, 40 years.
I want to keep up with the public markets for a second because they are a massive both communications entity. They attract a lot of powerful interests, and they can be such a bellwether of the level of activity in an industry. Right now, we're seeing stocks crater in Canada. And the question is, I guess, is there too much reliance on the public markets as a gauge of interest in terms of the institutionalization of this industry, as opposed to the development of good brands to create a normalization of this within the culture?
I think that's fair to say, yeah, without a doubt. What's happening in that Canadian public marketplace is a result of overvaluation. And you have these companies with these sky-high valuations. Really, where's the income? Where's the earnings? It's nowhere to be seen in many of these cases. A lot of these cases, we're starting to see the revenue start to pick up. Canada is a flower-only market. They're just now starting to transition to offer edibles and concentrates. But still, it's going to take a while for this course correction on the public market side. And I think we will have a more honest interpretation and conversation there in the next year and a half as that continues to correct itself.
So just to wrap up, are we still in the throat clearing stage of this industry in terms of its being part of a sanctioned patch in the culture?
Yeah, I get the question a lot, from friends, family who are thinking about jumping in. They're like, is it too late? And especially when you are in one of those OG markets. California was the first to ever legalize medical more than 20 years ago. Thank goodness to the activists in Northern California. Colorado was the first to implement regulations on medical and the first to implement regulations on recreational. But when we think about coming from the I just forgot the question. Yeah. What was the question again?
I think are we still clearing our throats?
Oh, yeah. So my family and friends ask me, is it too late? And absolutely not. We are on the precipice of this. We are still in the first inning, without a doubt, because some of the things I just discussed, there is tremendous potential ahead. As people say, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Cannabis is legal. It's only going to become more increasingly legal here and abroad, and that's what you're going to see over the next few decades.
Well, that's very exciting. Ricardo, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all.